Okay, so good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this live stream of our class on the Intertestamental Period. Tonight we're going to be looking at Daniel's prophecies of the period. I'm going to pretty strongly suggest that if you have a Bible handy, that you go ahead and have that Bible with you tonight, because we're going to be reading actually quite a bit of texts from the scriptures, and they're long texts, so it would probably be good for you if you had your Bible handy as we study this evening. So I had a question here concerning lessons 5 and 6 on YouTube. Let me just go ahead and answer that for everybody. All the previous lessons are on our YouTube channel, and I will try to post a comment on this thread when we're finished that will have the link to that. Right now on our YouTube channel, the only titles that we have are the ones from the Intertestamental Period. And so it goes, and I think I've labeled them all as lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but you may have to dig around a little bit to get those titles. But they are definitely all on our YouTube channel. So that's what we're going to be trying to do. As long as we don't have any problems with the videos, we're going to keep trying to upload these videos to the YouTube channel so that people can access these later. If you can't access them on YouTube, let me say that if you have liked the North Beach Facebook page, the church, then you can always go to the video section on the Facebook page, and those videos are located there as well. And so there's a lot more videos on our Facebook church page, simply because there's some other things that end up going there as well. But on YouTube right now, the only thing that's there are the videos from the Intertestamental Period. So, having said that, let's go ahead and get into the class itself this evening. Let me just remind you that if you've got some questions, you can write those in the comments section, and I will be looking at my phone from time to time to see those so that I can address those hopefully during the class. If for some reason I miss a question and we move on from that material and I don't go back and get it, then I will try to get you an answer to that sometime after the class is over. So again, the Intertestamental Period, Daniel's prophecies. I really enjoy teaching this class, this particular lesson in the class, because a lot of what we do in this class is historical. As a matter of fact, up till now, almost everything we've done has been historical, if not everything that we've done has been historical. And sometimes it's not always easy to see why we're doing that and how that fits in. Well, when we get to Daniel's prophecies of the period, we begin to see why that history is so important. Now, having said that, I will tell you that there's a lot of prophecies in the book of Daniel that we're not going to look at this evening. We're only going to look at a few, three, simply because some of those prophecies are very difficult to discuss even in a face-to-face classroom setting, much less in an internet setting. So I'm not going to address some of those this evening. So if you had this spectacular question about a particular prophecy and then you're disappointed that we're not talking about that prophecy this evening, you can shoot me an email or shoot me a message, and I will try to get you some information that will help you in understanding those prophecies. But I really like talking about Daniel's prophecies because they talk about this period, and sometimes they talk very specifically about this period. As a matter of fact, some of the prophecies in Daniel are so specific that what people did in the past, and some still do in the present, is they would say, well, there is no way Daniel could have prophesied all of that with such specificity of details. And so they reached the conclusion that Daniel had to be written after the fact. It had to be written after all the things that happened after the close of the Old Testament period. Well, if you're a Bible believer, you don't have to worry about that, because we believe that the Bible is inspired by God, and so God is able to tell things in advance. And so that doesn't cause us any problems in understanding that Daniel could be so specific. But some of the prophecies in the book of Daniel are really some of the most specific prophecies that we will find anywhere in the Old Testament. Unfortunately, some of those prophecies are exactly the ones we won't be talking about tonight, because they're just so difficult to go into, because they're tied so closely to a lot of that history that we've talked about. So that's what we're going to be doing this evening. We're going to be talking about these prophecies in Daniel. Let's just say some things at the very beginning of this. First of all, we need to note that in the book of Daniel, there are several prophecies. Most of those are found in Daniel's chapter 7 through 12. Now, Daniel's an interesting book because it divides very, excuse me, it divides very nicely into two sections. Excuse me again, I've got a frog in my throat. Wow, I haven't done that yet on a live stream. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. Daniel chapter, the book of Daniel divides very nicely into two sections. We have Daniel chapter 1 through 6. That's the part of Daniel we're mostly familiar with. We read about the test of food in Daniel chapter 1. We read about the fiery furnace. We read about the Daniel in the lion's den. Those are stories we're familiar with. Those are very often stories that are a focus in our children's classes because they're such powerful stories and they're very, very easy to remember. Then, if we're following along in our Bibles, we get to Daniel chapter 7 and we start reading there and we say, whoa, this is different. This isn't like the earlier chapters, or at least most of the earlier chapters in the book of Daniel. And so what a lot of people do is they get to Daniel chapter 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, 11 and 12, and they tend to just gloss over that, or they read it very, very quickly without really understanding a whole lot of what's going on in there. So that bears remembering as we approach the book of Daniel, that there is that kind of dual nature to the book. You have the earlier chapters, you have the later chapters. I might also say this, that those later chapters of Daniel, 7 through 12, are what's called apocalyptic literature in the Bible. So the book of Daniel, along with the book of Ezekiel, along with the book of Zechariah in the Old Testament, belong to this very specific kind of literature called apocalyptic literature. When we get to the New Testament, we only have one book of that genre, and that's the book of Revelation. Having said that, when you spend some time in the latter half of Daniel, and you spend some time in Zechariah, and you spend some time in Ezekiel, you can understand how the book of Revelation kind of fits into that, because it's the same kind of genre, it's the same kind of literature. And so sometimes we're reading in the Old Testament, and it sounds an awful lot like we're reading in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. So that's what we're dealing with when we're looking at the second half of the book of Daniel. So as I said earlier, a detailed discussion of these prophecies is simply not possible in the confines of this class. I will tell you that when I teach this in an in-person setting, I do this in two classes. I teach two classes where we look at all these prophecies, and we probably run over anyways, time-wise, and end up going into a third class. Tonight, we're just going to do it in one class, and so I had to shorten that and cut out a lot of material. It's just not possible. Now, I will tell you that we do teach a class at Beach on the book of Daniel, and we go into a lot more detail in that class as we look at these prophecies. So tonight, what we're going to have is we're going to have a limited, quick overview of the prophecies. Now, I said that most of the prophecies are in Daniel chapter 7 through 12, but we're actually going to start tonight in Daniel chapter 2. And so again, if you've got your Bibles handy, I'd encourage you to take them and go to Daniel chapter 2. We're going to read a large section of this passage, but I think it will be good for you if you have your Bible and are following along with me as we study this book. So Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 2, this is probably of all the prophecies, this is the one that stands out. This is the one probably we're most familiar with in the book of Daniel, probably because it comes from those first 6 chapters where we spend so much time. But in Daniel chapter 2, we have an account of the fact that the Babylonian king, whose name was Nebuchadnezzar, had a dream. And that dream troubled him greatly, and he wanted to know what that dream was about. And so he had the wise men, he gave a message to the wise men in Babylon, his advisors, the astrologers. He said, I want to know the interpretation of this dream. But I'm not going to tell you what the dream was. You're going to have to figure out what the dream was, and then you can tell me the interpretation. That's kind of sly on Nebuchadnezzar's part, because he knew that these men could often kind of give whatever interpretation they wanted to a dream if they knew what the dream was. And so he tells them, you've got to tell me the dream, and then I want to hear the interpretation. Well, all the wise men and astrologers of Babylon scratch their heads at that, and they complain. They say, nobody can do that. You're asking too much, king. Well, Nebuchadnezzar decreed that if they couldn't do that, they were all going to be put to death. Now, Daniel belonged to the class of wise men, advisors to the king, but he doesn't hear immediately about the decree. And so he's going to learn of it. And when he learns of it, he asks for time so that he can discover what the dream is and what its interpretation is. Now, we understand from the text that he's able to discover that Because he prays to God for that, and God gives him the interpretation. So the king's dream here in Daniel chapter 2 is revealed to Daniel, as well as the meaning. And so he's able to go to the king, he's able to tell him the dream, and then he's able to give the interpretation. So the king is going to understand that the interpretation is accurate because Daniel knows what the dream is. So basically in this dream, and I'm going to pull up an artistic rendition there of what Nebuchadnezzar sees in the dream. Nebuchadnezzar sees a statue. The statue has 4 parts. Part of it is made out of gold, part of it's made out of silver, part of it's made out of bronze, and part of it's made out of iron and iron mixed with clay. So there are 4 parts to the statue. And I will just say this, the artistic rendition, you got the guy holding a sword and a scepter. That's not in the book of Daniel at all. So let me just point that out. Especially if you got your kids watching, they see that sword and they say, I didn't know he had a sword. No, the text doesn't say that. The artist put it in there for us. He took that liberty. So King Nebuchadnezzar had seen this statue, but that isn't all that Nebuchadnezzar saw in the dream, because then he sees a stone that comes, it strikes against the statue, strikes against the image, it smashes the image, and then that stone grows into a mountain. And so that's the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Daniel gets not only the dream, but he gets the interpretation from God. And so let's go ahead and start reading in Daniel chapter 2. We're going to pick up the reading in verse 36. Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 36. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of men, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, we're now in verse 44 in the reading, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation sure. So that's what we read in the book of Daniel. Let's just kind of lay this out for ourselves. We have, first of all, the head of gold. That's the top part of the statue. Daniel tells us very plainly that that head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. Now, I think what's going on here, my understanding of this, is that Nebuchadnezzar is representing Babylon, because then the rest of the text is not talking about kings, but talking about kingdoms. And so we have the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar. He's the king of Babylon. Then we have in the dream and in the interpretation following Babylon, we have yet another kingdom. Chest and arms that are made out of silver, that represents Persia. Then we have the middle and the thighs of bronze, that represents Greece. Then we have the legs and feet, that represents Rome. And then finally we have in the interpretation that God's kingdom is going to be established during the Roman period. Now let me just say this. When Daniel is giving this dream to Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar knows he's the king of Babylon. He knows what the empire is right now. It's his empire. His empire is going to stand for some decades after he dies. What he doesn't know is what that next kingdom is going to be. And apparently it's not revealed to Daniel either. We know these things because we can look backwards in time and see how it's fulfilled. We have the benefit of hindsight, if you will. So we know that after Babylon came Persia. We had a class on that in the Intertestamental Period. There was a reason for that. Then we know that following Persia, we have the kingdom of Greece. We've spent time talking about that and all the things that followed after Alexander conquered the Persian Empire. And then we know historically that another kingdom replaces the Greek Empire, and that's Rome. Now, we haven't talked about Rome from a historical standpoint yet. We've only been seeing how it intermingles or how it intersects with some of these other kingdoms. We're going to talk about Rome next week, so we're kind of jumping into the middle of that. And then we find out that it's during the days of those kings that God's kingdom, that God establishes his kingdom, and that's established during the Roman period. Now, I got to tell you, if you are looking at Daniel chapter 2 and you are understanding the prophecy here, and you are someone who is out there saying, well, God's kingdom hasn't been established yet, well, Daniel's prophecy would say otherwise. Because Daniel's prophecy, this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and the interpretation that Daniel gets from God, lays all this out for us. We see Babylon. We know after Babylon came Persia. We know after Persia came Greece. We know after Greece came Rome. And the text is clear. It is during the days of those kings, the Roman kings, that God establishes his kingdom. So we need to understand that those who are of the premillennial persuasion, that believe that the kingdom has not yet been established, or they believe that Jesus came to establish the kingdom, but he was unsuccessful, so he established the church in its place, we need to understand what that really means. What that really means is that the prophecy of Daniel was not fulfilled. That would mean that Daniel was not inspired. That brings a whole lot of questions into play, doesn't it? Because if Daniel was incorrect and Daniel wasn't inspired, then how can we trust any of the Old Testament? Truth be told, how can we trust any of the New Testament either? Daniel tells us that God's kingdom was going to be established in the days of that fourth kingdom. It is Rome. That's Daniel chapter 2. Let's continue on. There's nothing else to go into except to go into the next chapter, which is not 3 for us. It's Daniel chapter 7. So go ahead and take your Bibles and go over to Daniel chapter 7. I'm going to have to open my Bible to that as well because we're going to read this chapter together. Daniel chapter 7, we get the next prophecy that I want us to talk about. Daniel chapter 7 is set during the first year of Belshazzar, not Nebuchadnezzar now, Belshazzar, King Belshazzar of Babylon. We remember this fella. Belshazzar is the fella who in Daniel chapter 5 is presented with the handwriting on the wall. And so that's that Belshazzar that we're talking about. This prophecy is dated to the first year of his reign, which would be about 553 BC. Let's go ahead and read the chapter together. Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. Okay, I got a question on the Facebook. I'm going to get to that here in just a minute when we finish the chapter and talk about the prophecy itself. So we're in verse 11. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and time. I saw in the night visions, we're in verse 13 now, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. Here we go. Now we've got the interpretation. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. Notice with me, if you will, you have the juxtaposition here of kings and kingdoms. The kings are representing kingdoms. Verse 19, then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. And the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. Okay, so this is the chapter. We read the whole chapter. In this chapter, we see that Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts. The first of those is a lion with an eagle's wings. The second of those is a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. The third of these is a leopard with 4 bird wings and 4 heads. The fourth beast is described as having 10 horns, and then with an 11th horn, and it is described as being exceedingly terrifying. Now I'm going to pull up another artistic rendition, not mine, but another rendition that was done by an artist to kind of give us an idea of what these beasts looked like. The lion with the eagle's wings, that's pretty easy. We get the bear with the ribs, that's pretty easy. We get the leopard with the 4 heads and the bird wings, that's pretty easy. Then we get the fourth beast. Now the artist here chose to represent the fourth beast as a dragon. Daniel doesn't say so. Daniel doesn't say so. So he's taking some artistic license here. I will tell you that that's probably coming out of some idea coming out of the book of Revelation. I'm not real sure why he chose to do it that way. Probably because he had to depict it in some way, and he chose to use a dragon. But what we do get in the artistic rendition is we get the horns. So we get this dragon, we get this terrifying beast that has these horns. These are the beasts that Daniel sees. The interpretation of the vision tells us what they represent. They represent kingdoms that are yet to come. Daniel chapter 7 is basically giving us the same information as Daniel chapter 2. Let me pull up a chart here. We already read the interpretation. So the kingdoms that are laid out for us here are Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. In Daniel chapter 2, they're represented with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, middle and thighs of bronze, legs and feet of iron and clay. In Daniel chapter 7, they're represented as a lion with wings, a bear, a leopard with wings and with four heads, and this terrifying beast with iron horns. In Daniel chapter 7, though, the focus is on the fourth beast, and particularly the horn that makes war against the saints. Now, I will tell you what I think. I think that probably, in my view, I'm giving some caveats there, okay? That probably that 11th horn is representing Domitian. Domitian was the first emperor to persecute God's people as a matter of state policy. Nero persecuted on a whim Christians in the city of Rome. That is not to make light of that persecution. For those Christians in the city of Rome, it was a horrible persecution. Many Christians died in Rome under Nero. But Domitian was different because Domitian comes along, he institutes it as a matter of state policy that Christianity is illegal and Christians are going to be persecuted. Not all the details in this vision should be taken literally. Not all are meant to be taken literal. This is something that I emphasize when I teach apocalyptic literature, whether it be Ezekiel or Daniel or Zechariah or the book of Revelation, that sometimes details are there just for the purpose of filling in the details. What I try to tell people is that apocalyptic literature is extremely visual. We are meant to visualize. We're meant to hear and see and even sometimes smell what's discussed in the text. And so you go to the book of Revelation and you read about smoke and you read about the sounds of what's going on. That's apocalyptic literature. Not all details should be taken literally. And I fully admit that equating number 11 with Domitian may well be taking something literally that isn't meant to be. Now, the question was raised, and I want to go ahead and address that. And the question is, in Daniel, all this has come to pass. Is it the same as Revelation? The answer in a nutshell, in a short way, is yes. Daniel chapter 7 is a reflection of the book of Revelation. What's going on in Daniel chapter 7 is explained, and we see it again in Daniel chapter 7. Let me go back to that thought in just a moment, but let me go ahead and pull up the emperors of Rome, because I need us to understand how this worked. So we have the first 11 emperors of Rome. We start off with number 1, Augustus. Now you might be sitting out there this evening and saying, well, whoa. Caesar, Julius Caesar was the first emperor, the first Caesar of Rome, right? Well, no, he wasn't. Julius Caesar would have liked to have been, but it's Augustus who's the first emperor. We count the Roman Empire historically as having been established with Augustus as emperor. Following him, we have Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Okay, we talked about him. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, not too important. Vespasian, Titus, and then Domitian. Domitian was the one who instituted an empire-wide persecution of Christians. We have a bust of him. We know what he looked like, okay, at least from the sculptures that are left from this fella. And of course, I think he's illustrated here in Daniel chapter 7 as that 11th horn that's speaking blasphemies and makes war against God's people. It's Domitian that does that. It is in the days of Domitian that the Apostle John is exiled to Patmos, and it's on the island of Patmos that he receives the vision that's written down as the book of Revelation. And so I think that Daniel chapter 7 ties very closely into the book of Revelation. Now let me just say this, because we're going to move on to our next prophecy in just a moment, and it's going to take us in a little bit different direction. And so I want to address this before we go on. Remember Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 2, we read about the statue of 4 parts. We read about the stone that strikes the statue and smashes the statue, and then the stone becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth. Sometimes what we do with Daniel chapter 2 is we say Daniel chapter 2 is fulfilled on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. You've probably heard that before. I've probably said that before. Can I qualify that statement and say that on the day of Pentecost, we see the beginning of the final fulfillment of Daniel chapter 2? Because in Daniel chapter 2, it isn't just about the establishment of the kingdom. It's about how that kingdom is going to prevail over the other kingdoms and is going to fill the earth. And that, in a nutshell, is what the book of Revelation is all about. The book of Revelation is about the fact that God's kingdom is going to prevail over the enemy that's warring against it. The enemy at that time of the book of Revelation being the Roman Empire, and specifically the Emperor Domitian. And there were Christians in the days of John who were being persecuted for their faith. There were Christians who were dying for their faith. There were Christians who were asking themselves, is it worth it to be a Christian? If we're losing our property, if we're seeing our families killed, if we're being killed, is it really worth it to do that? The message of Revelation is God wins, Satan loses. Those who are on God's side are going to win with God. Those who are on Satan's side are going to lose with him. So stay faithful. If you signed up for my Revelation class that I'm starting on Sunday evening at North Beach, we're going to be doing that on Facebook Live as well. If you signed up for my Revelation class, or if you're listening to this broadcast and you want to join in that, you are certainly welcome to do that. It's open to the public, if you will. We're going to talk about that theme Sunday night because Revelation is about victory in Christ. It is about the fact that the kingdom that's established and foretold in Daniel chapter 2 is going to fill the earth and prevail over every enemy that comes against it. So yes, Daniel chapter 7 for us today has been fulfilled. It's past tense. For Daniel, it's still future tense. The book of Revelation in the days of John was still future tense. For us, it's past tense, at least that primary part of it that talks about that war between Rome and the church. All right. I hope that kind of explains that a little bit. If you have some questions about that, shoot me a message, shoot me an email, and I will try to get you some more information that you can look at as well. Let's go ahead and talk about our last prophecy this evening from the book of Daniel that concerns this period, and that's Daniel chapter 8. So go ahead, you should already be there. If you were following along in Daniel chapter 7, you're right there. We're going to pick up in Daniel chapter 8 in just a moment. But Daniel chapter 8 is also dated. It is dated to the third year, this time of Belshazzar. Remember, Daniel chapter 7 is to the first year, 553. This vision is dated to the third year of Belshazzar, which would be about 550 BC. Okay, so early on in Belshazzar's reign, this is the vision. Let's go ahead and read Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, I was at the Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had two horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. The ram had no power to stand before him, and he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. There was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. If you were here when we studied the rise of Alexander and what happened afterwards and the rise of Persia, this probably sounds really familiar. Verse 9, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it, together with the regular burnt offering, because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I saw a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. And he said to me, "Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end." When he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia." Here we get the interpretation. "And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many. And he shall rise, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. All right, Daniel chapter 8. This particular vision is limited in scope to 2 empires, and we know what they are because the text tells us. The first of those is the ram, representing the Persian Empire. The ram has 2 horns. Remember, we talk about it as the Persian Empire, but it was an empire that was composed of 2 peoples, the Medes and the Persians. They get together, and in the person of Cyrus, they're united even by blood. In the person of Cyrus, that's the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire conquers and is able to establish itself. The ram is powerful. But then comes the goat, the male goat. The male goat represents Greece. And that goat comes from the west. It's exactly where we'd expect that kingdom to come from, because that's where Greece is in relation to Persia. So the male goat comes. It comes from the west. It travels quickly without touching the ground. Verse 5. Now you remember from the class on Alexander the Great that here's this guy that is able to conquer the Persian Empire very quickly. Everywhere he goes, he wins. As a matter of fact, the longest he spends in any place trying to defeat an enemy is when he spends 7 months besieging the city of Tyre. Everywhere else he goes, except for the times of the year when you don't campaign in the ancient world, he's just beating the Persians everywhere. And so he conquers the Persian Empire. And so he's doing that very, very quickly. So the vision has him running so fast that his feet aren't even touching the ground. That's the kind of speed that he's able to conquer the Persian Empire. He tramples the ram. When he's strong, though, that conspicuous horn is broken. And again, you remember from our class on Alexander that at his very height, when he has conquered this incredibly large empire, he dies very unexpectedly, because when he dies, he has not made any provision at all for what's going to happen to his empire after he's gone. Let's look again, another artistic rendition of this. Kind of put that in your mind's eye, if you will. This ram that's there, and then this goat with one horn. Somebody might say, well, I guess that's a unigoat. I don't know. It's a goat with one horn, crashes against the ram and tramples him and defeats him. So That's what's pictured in the chapter. We get the interpretation. Again, the vision is limited in scope to 2 empires. The male goat is Greece. We read that after that horn is broken, 4 horns arise in his place. We studied this historically. These are the 4 main successor states. We have Macedonia under Antipater and then Cassander. We have the kingdom in Thrace under Lysimachus. Then we have the Greek kingdom in Egypt, the Ptolemies. Then we have the Greek kingdom in Asia and Macedonia, the Seleucids. And it is out of that kingdom, that Seleucid kingdom, that we get that out of that 4th kingdom, we get that little horn, verse 9. And again, if you remember from the class, I think you can probably understand who that horn is. The little horn is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Remember him? This is the Seleucid king who goes down to Egypt because he wants to conquer the Ptolemies. He encounters a Roman ambassador there. The Roman ambassador says it is the will of Rome that you leave Egypt. Antiochus IV says, well, I'll think about it. The ambassador draws a circle in the sand around Antiochus and says, you think about it before you leave that circle. And Antiochus IV leaves Egypt, goes back to Palestine, and wages war against God's people. The text here talks about the fact that he grew great towards the south, that's Egypt, toward the east, that's Mesopotamia, and the glorious land, that's Judea. That is a depiction, that is a description of the area of Seleucid rule. And this horn considers himself deity. Verses 10 and 11 here in Daniel chapter 8. Remember, Antiochus takes that title Epiphanes, took the title God Manifest. Antiochus really thought he was a god and really expected people to worship him. And it caused him great pains and anger and heartache when the Jews said, we're not going to have any of that. We're not going to worship you as if you were some kind of a god. So in his war against the people, he overthrows the sanctuary, verses 11 and 12. We read about the transgression that makes desolate in verse 13. This is all a depiction of the war of Antiochus IV against God's people that, of course, we know from the class gave rise to the Maccabean revolt that eventually led to an independent Jewish state being established again under the Maccabees and then under the Hasmoneans once they become a dynasty. So that's the last of the prophecies that I want to talk about this evening. Again, there's some other great prophecies that we didn't get to talk about this evening. Probably don't lend themselves very well to this format of a class anyways. So just to summarize a little bit, Daniel chapter 2 is an overall vision. It stretches to the Roman era and the establishment and victory of the kingdom. So the day of Pentecost and beyond. Daniel chapter 7 is also an overall vision stretching to the Roman Empire, Roman era, and emphasizing the persecution of God's people, specifically under the Emperor Domitian. Daniel chapter 8 is specific to events between Greece and Persia, but with heavy emphasis on the actions of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So what I want us to see as we look at this is that we see Daniel writing under Babylonian rule and then at the end of his life under Persian rule. That's Daniel chapter 6. He receives these visions that spell out history is written before it happens. And the prophecies are so specific that Bible doubters have said Daniel had to be written a couple of hundred years BC after all of these events. No, Daniel is inspired by the God of heaven who knows the future and holds the future in his hand. Next week on Thursday, we're going to continue. We're going to talk about the rise of Rome. We've hinted about this. We've even talked about a little bit as we see the Romans come into interaction with Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Like we said, there in Egypt. We also saw his interaction with the Jews in ending the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty is ended by Rome. But I want us to spend some time next week talking about the rise of Rome, because when we get to the New Testament, Rome is the power that's in control. And so I want us to see how that came about. It's going to be a historical overview as we look to Rome and how they came to be. in a position to be over the Jews in that area of the world, and how it is that that the Jews are under Roman control in the first century. So I hope you'll turn in. I hope you'll tune in next Thursday night. I'll also say, these are going on our YouTube channel. It takes me a little while to get the video up there. I will type the link in here because that's already been asked for. The only files on the YouTube channel right now are these videos. The other thing I just might point out, I know some of y'all are not members at Beach. We're going to be doing my class on Revelation. I start that Sunday evening at 5, correct? And we're going to be doing that on Sunday evenings at 5 and Wednesday evenings at 7. We're going to be live streaming that, okay? It's going to be on Facebook Live, not in Zoom. It's going to be on Facebook Live. And so if you'd like to tune into that or watch the videos after the fact, you're going to have the opportunity to do that as well. Once we get back to in-person Bible classes at the building, I do not know when that will be, but once we get back to that, I'm going to continue to live stream the Revelation classes for those who are still not comfortable being back at the building among a lot of other folks. So that's going to be something we're going to be talking about. So if you wanted to study the book of Revelation, you signed up for my class at Beach, that's great. If you wanted to study the book of Revelation, you're not a member at Beach, you can tune in at those times, or you can go back later and find the videos on Facebook. Thank you again for tuning in this evening. I look forward to having all of y'all back hopefully next week on Thursday night at 7 p.m. So I wish you all the best and have a good evening. Thank you.